Okay, so before we start, some technicalities, some organizational stuff and so on. So you all know that there is a website for this, right? Do you have the URL? Oh, okay. Which has a draft schedule and a reading list. And I also wanted to ask, do you have all the readings? Did you get them? There were some copies. Do you have them? Does anyone not have any of these readings? Okay, well, we'll just assume. Did you all read those readings? I assume not, so don't worry. I know it's a lot of stuff. There were some in brackets that were labeled optional, but even those that are not in brackets, there's a lot of them, and I don't assume that you have read all of them very carefully. So don't worry, that's okay. We will talk slowly and go through things at our own pace. And we will, today at least, not follow any particular one of these readings very closely. Tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we'll be looking at a couple of papers that will be pretty much the topic of that day. But today it's just preparatory stuff and so on. So what else? So as Professor Tankubo already said, I will be speaking English, but questions and comments and so on are okay in Japanese. And I strongly encourage you to ask, to interrupt me, to bring your questions, comments, ask for clarification, whatever. Because I really don't know what to expect from this audience, right? It really helps both of us to adjust the level and the pace and all of these things. So if you could just always let me know whether I'm too fast, too slow, and so on, too basic, too advanced, whatever. Just let me know, tell me. And we are working under some technical constraints here. I don't have a small microphone to put on my collar. I wish I did, but it doesn't work in this room for some reason. So if my voice deteriorates, I will have to use this, but I try to do without it. It's a long day, so we don't know. It may happen. And there is the NHK video taping. So this is also new to me, almost, I guess. But we'll see how it works. Okay, I hope these things won't get in the way very much. So I will be using the Blackboard sometimes, and nothing else. Does everyone have a handout? There is a handout of over 30 pages. This started as my notes for these lectures, but then I decided I might as well give it to you. I also will put this on the web, on this website. So today in the evening, I suppose, there will be a PDF file that you can download. There is more for this is only for today. There's more for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. I think we'll bring those copies also, but I will also put them on the web, so if you want to download them, that will be fine. Okay, so what else? Yeah, so I wanted to know a little bit about this audience. You are, I heard, from a very diverse set of backgrounds. Could I poll you a little bit and ask you, who is a linguist here? Who considers themselves a linguist? A linguistics student or professor, whatever, primarily. See, less than half or so, about half. So what about the others? Who are the philosophers? Lots of philosophers, right? And others? Computer science or what is it? Oh, computers, right. Anyone else? No. Yeah, how many of you are graduate students? Daigakuin-sei? Most, yeah. And others? Undergraduate? Daigakusei? No. Professors? Okay, not many. That's good. Yes. See, the problem is in preparing these lectures, it was very hard to know what level to expect. And it's a very mixed group still. Some of you, probably the philosophers, have a good grounding in logic and modal logic and so on, but linguists may not have that background. And then it's the other way around for the linguistics, the linguistic data and so on, and the literature. So at various points over these 3 days, some of you will be bored, inevitably. And I just ask you to put up with it. There's no other way to do it. Just to be safe, I decided to start with very elementary set theory and really work up from the basics. And if you have seen all this before, I hope it doesn't hurt to see it again. Okay, so that will be part of today's time, these formal basics. Well, let's turn to the first section of this handout before I say a little bit more about the schedule for these 3 days. Our topic is modality. And the first question to ask is what exactly that is in a linguistic sense. And there are various ways of putting it, giving answers to these. On the handout, there is this Kratzer quote, which is pretty much how everyone, almost everyone in literature starts to talk about modality, saying that it's about what is possible and what is necessary. Oh, are there more handouts lacking? Handouts lacking? No. So it's about necessity and possibility. The same comes out of the philosophical literature. This Hughes and Creswell textbook says pretty much the same thing. Modal logic is the logic of necessity and possibility, of must be and may be. Now there is a difference between modality in linguistics and modal logic. Of course, modal logic is a formal system, whereas modal expressions in language, well, modal logic may be useful in their analysis, but it's not the same thing. And Palmer, in this third paragraph, relates these modal expressions to other grammatical categories, which is, for a linguist, a very useful thing to do, saying that tense, aspect, and modality are in some way concerned with the event or situation that is being reported, and they all, well, they add different connotations to the assertion, to say different things about that event in question. Tense locates it in time. Aspect looks at its internal structure. By the way, not everyone may know these terms, aspect and so on. It won't show up very much. Let's gloss over it, but it's also okay to ask questions about that. And modality is concerned with the status of the proposition that describes the event. That is useful. I think this is a nice way of putting it, and it's also good to relate modality to these other categories, tense and so on. Part of the goal for these 3 days is to work our way up to an analysis of some temporal / modal expressions in English, which actually incorporates both of these things, temporal reference, modality, and so on. So because they are often very closely related in language. Now, so let me say here, like in 4, modality is about relations of consequence and consistency. This is actually saying pretty much the same thing as 1 and 2, but looking at it from a slightly different angle, which makes pretty clear what we will be talking about. The evaluation of a sentence P relative to some body of information A. So we may just say, we have whatever this is, there is some information A, your knowledge, for instance. What do you know? The information you have at your disposal, and based on this information, you say something about P, namely that it is possible, for all you know, or it follows from what you know. It is necessary. You know it's the case. You think it may be the case. and so on. So there are some elements here which enter the formal analysis of modal expressions in natural language. First of all, what is this information A? I just said it may be your knowledge, but that is just one way of interpreting modals, and we'll see other ways of interpreting them relative to other bodies of information, background information. So sometimes this can be some fantasy, some purely hypothetical assumption. Sometimes it may be, for example, all the possible ways a computer program may terminate. Right? And whatever it is, some assertion or some proposition is portrayed in relation to this. So there is this connection here which may be consequence or compatibility or things like that. So the direction and the strength of this relation are another parameter of modal expressions. By direction I mean something like, is P an explanation for what you have observed, or is P an effect of some cause that you assume might happen, and so on. There's a direction of this relationship, and the strength, of course. How likely is P given A? That is how modal expressions differ, what they encode. Okay. And then there's, on this handout, they say speaker's confidence that the relationship holds. Well, yeah, that will we may be able to get to that topic as well, but maybe not. We only have 3 days. So in English, some typical modal expressions are listed on the second page of this handout. Obviously, these auxiliaries, which are called modal auxiliaries, they are prime examples, like must, may, might, can, and so on. In English, we are only talking about English, not Japanese. We can talk about that too, but there the literature is not as developed, the formal semantic literature. So I would like to stay with English most of the time, at least. We have these adjectives like invincible, permissible, payable, fragile, and so on, which, well, there are certain differences between them. You may already notice if you know these adjectives. Invincible means if you say that about someone, he or she cannot be defeated. Cannot be defeated. It's a negation of a possibility. Permissible is well, it's a positive possibility, right? Payable is not about possibilities, but actually about necessity. It means that if something is payable within 2 weeks, it means you have to pay it within 2 weeks. Not like you could or you can choose to. You must. So these verbs they differ in very subtle ways between themselves. Mortal, likewise, is about necessity, because we all are mortal. That means we have to die, not we can, right? Whereas edible and fertile is again about possibilities, right? It could be eaten, it could reproduce, right? Okay, but all of these are, well, for one thing, derived from Latin and have a certain morphological makeup, but the meaning is not constant across all of them. Right? These adverbs, presumably, possibly, probably, and so on, they are often used to express these degrees of strength with which a proposition follows from some assumption, and so on. Then there is what has been called inherent modality, which means a sentence or an expression can only be understood with reference to modal notions, even though there is no modal visible. It's not there in the sentence. Like this room seats 50 people, or this car goes 20 miles, 80 miles, whatever. Can be said and is often used to mean that the room can seat 50 people, or that the car can go 80 miles. So this sentence may be true of a car that has never been driven at any speed over 50 miles. Still, it goes 80 miles because it can. That's what these sentences mean. This is one of the most tricky and least understood kind of moral expressions. There are not many analyses of this. And then, of course, certain other grammatical categories. I already talked about this interrelation between modality and tense. And we have here, for example, the famous progressive paradox. If we have something like, linguists will be familiar with this, John was drawing a circle. Here so if we have something like John was drawing, and this, by the way, similar things happen in Japanese and in other languages. This entails that John drew. Can you see this? This is too small. What about this? Should I write bigger letters? It's okay. Whereas John was drawing, you have to give me some reaction, otherwise. I'll just go on. So, well, it's up to you. You choose. John was drawing a circle. A circle does not entail that John drew a circle. It's a famous imperfective paradox, as it has been called. The analysis of this, so the thing is, if he never did draw a circle, under what circumstances can you still say that this is the case, right? I mean, some facts have to be in place in order for this to be true, but the existence of a circle is not required. Other things are required, namely that there might have been a circle if he had not been interrupted or things like that. Right? And that's this purely modal analysis of this phenomenon. Also, these temporal conjunctions, for they have there, Mary diffused the bomb before it exploded, can have. Let me put these sentences on. Mary diffused the bomb before it exploded. Does not entail that the bomb exploded, right? Let me call this D and this E for diffuse and explode. So we can say that D before E does not entail that it exploded, but of course E after D, the bomb exploded. Well, we couldn't actually say this. Well, it's a bit weird. There has to be a second fuse somewhere in the bomb, right? Because, never mind. After D does entail that it exploded, right? And you have sentences like, Mozart died before he finished his Requiem. Right? It doesn't entail that he finished his Requiem. And things like that. But again, just like here, we have these modal conditions on the truth of a sentence like this. Right. So we can't say, I did these lectures before I was born Japanese, or before I became Japanese. I never became Japanese, so that's false too, just like to claim that the bomb exploded, but obviously sentence is odd, so the falsehood of the second sentence is not sufficient for the truth of the whole. What is required was some modal notion, some counterfactual, right? And the third example here in 5C, John submits his paper and so on. This we will talk about on Sunday regarding something, well, this is something I have written a paper about, and we'll discuss that on Sunday. It's also very intimately tied to modality, the interpretation of sentences like this, but in a way which will become clear later. Okay, so now there are also closely related notions like propositional attitudes. I say here believe and doubt and wish and so on. Those verbs, they are all like modals in that their analysis requires modal logic, or often involves modal logic. You would not, however, call them modal verbs or modal auxiliaries, or not even modal expressions, unless you stretch the term a little bit. And I say here in this paragraph, while as I think so, they make statements directly about propositional attitudes, but a real, truly modal expression like John may come. The fact that this is true, suppose it is true, its truth may depend on some propositional attitude of yours, because you have beliefs of a certain kind, right, or expectations, or because you consider it likely or so. But that's not strictly what it says. It's not the same as saying I believe, or that John may come. So there is clearly a very tight connection between them, but we will not be talking about propositional attitudes here. And evidentiality is another area where modal notions have been applied. In English, we have these sentences in 7 that restaurant is supposed to be good. You probably, I think you may be familiar with this use of supposed to be, right? It means they say the restaurant is good. It does not mean it ought to be good or has to be good. There's a different meaning of supposed to be. Here, these things are used, these expressions, it's supposed to be good, are used to say, to assert something like, I have heard, or people tell me that it is good. So it's a bit like Japanese, right? Soda and so on. Right? Or rashi, or something. And then you must be tired. Must, the auxiliary must is a difficult case because it often, or generally, perhaps always, involves some implicit reference to a source of information, just like 7a in a sense, and some inference you draw. So people have sometimes classified it as an evidential, others say it's a modal. There is a lot of debate and uncertainty in this literature, and even the very line between modality and evidentiality is not so clear. Still, in these lectures we will not be talking about evidentials either. That's a whole different topic, which we won't get into. All right. Now, this body of let me get rid of some of this. These examples, and back to this picture. So a modal sentence like John may come asserts that John's coming is somehow compatible with some body of information. Okay. This body of information is called the modal base in the linguistic literature, formal semantic literature. And we will then later talk about the formal representation of this. For now, just let's say this is somehow some information. Now this can be of various kinds. As I said, I mentioned beliefs before, but the table at the top of page 3 lists a whole range of possible meanings for this, and these aren't even all of the possibilities that have been used and proposed in literature. Now suppose we are talking about something which involves the notion of necessity. And let me give a very artificial sounding paraphrase. It is necessary that John comes this uses the word necessary, which modal logicians, as we have seen, usually say is one of the basic notions in modality. We can also say that John's coming follows from this body of information. Now, the variation that we see between these modal bases is best understood or illustrated when we consider what this actually may mean in any particular case. If it follows from the modal base, well, if the modal base is what you know, your belief, your knowledge state, then John's coming follows from that knowledge state if you know that he comes, right? So we can say there, first line there, second line, epistemic modality. P is known by someone, speaker presumably. That is what the necessity modal means if the modal base is epistemic. Now there are other modal bases. Doxastic is about belief. That's only slightly different from knowledge. It's almost the same thing, but beliefs may be false, whereas knowledge is true. Knowledge is true belief, at least that's what philosophers say. So we can just distinguish here between P is known and P is believed, as the paraphrase is for. P follows from this modal base, a doxastic modal base, right? Now this stereotypical is not very common as a term. It has been used in the linguistic literature, that's why I'm calling it this. Others might call it likelihood or something like that, or normalcy, if you are more familiar with that. So P normally happens. So right. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that P does happen. We'll talk about that later. Deontic modality. This is about obligations, permissions, and things like that. And then necessarily P means P is required, or the subject, John in this case, has to come, right? Is under some obligation to come. And then there are this volitive or volitional, as it's often called, is willing to come. John, can get John to come, something like that. Dispositional and so on. John wants to come, John prefers to come, and so on. So the list is a bit open-ended, and even within it, there is some variation in the way individual authors employ these terms. But generally, this is sort of, these are the most commonly discussed modal bases in the linguistic literature. Now, this is, what you see there in the right-hand column is about necessity, and you can now think about what would possibly or possibility mean for each of these things. There isn't always a nice paraphrase for it, except down there in what I say, dispositional ones, where the necessity means something like cannot but P. John has to come in the sense that he cannot resist the urge or something like that. Right? There, the possibility is John is able to come. Well, there we have a nice word for the other side. But generally, so for epistemic, well, it's compatible with your beliefs that he comes, or consistent, right? Likewise, doxastic. In the Deontic case, John is allowed to come. It is permissible. Volitive, I guess, would mean something like would not object to coming, or so. I'm not sure. So for each of these modal bases, we get a different flavor of the meaning of necessity and possibility. Right? There's always this notion of consequence. So authors in various traditions have also tried to unify or sort of classify these a little bit more. So for example, let me put it, we have epistemic and doxastic, and so on. And also perhaps these stereotypical ones. I won't put this here because I'm not so sure about that. And then deontic, volitive, and yeah, the ability modal. I don't list ability down here because I think it is maybe related to the dispositional case. But there is much variation in the terminology authors employ. But about these, Frank Palmer, who looks at these things from a purely descriptive linguistic point of view, he would say, so this is Palmer, you classify these together as, well, I guess, epistemic and then he also puts these together under the label dynamic. This is a bit odd. I never understood why you would call this dynamic. I'm not sure, but it's not his actually. It's it has been around. And then, so let me make sure that I don't have any mistakes. Right. And so these for Palmer would then go together as event modality. I'm saying this because you're likely to encounter this terminology if you work in this area. Palmer, I'm getting this from this Cambridge textbook, which is quite commonly used, even though it's the perspective that he takes is totally disjoint from formal semantics, and it's hard to relate these things to each other. So it's not always easy to get on top of the literature. Now he also would put evidential in here and call them evidential modals, and there he has some more distinctions between reported and sensory. So you may have in some languages, including Japanese, or well, some languages have a richer inventory than even Japanese. So you may have different verbal affixes, for instance, some of which you choose when you have seen or experienced the event yourself, or seen or heard it happen, so, and others you would use if people told you. And then there are further distinctions. How did they tell you? How sure are you? And so on. I'm putting this here in red because it's not part of what we will be talking about, but it's useful to know that these have been grouped together. In fact, these go together for Palmer as propositional modality. So that's just one example of a classification that has been around. In the formal semantic literature, there's only one distinction that is really quite significant, and that is on here between these two and these three. And more generally, it's in this table between the ones that I paraphrase as something like, you know, a statement about P, the top 5, 4, P is known, the case, and so on. And the other ones, which I paraphrased there as statements about someone, right? So X is required to do P and so on, right? About the subject of the sentence. If we have John must come, then it would be John is required to come. And here in the linguistic literature, this is often called epistemic modality and root modality. And you may have seen these distinctions, I'm not sure. It actually shows up tomorrow in some of the readings after Kratzer. We will look at some of the evidence, the syntactic evidence, that they are in fact distinct structurally. Although I should say again, there's no consensus. People don't agree on any of this, right? But there is a distinction here, which I try to hint at in these paraphrases, where you know, the upper ones here, the epistemic ones, are supposed to be raising verbs, and the lower ones control verbs. And we'll talk about that particular assumption tomorrow. And if you haven't heard those terms yet, then you will tomorrow. It's okay. So I have here a digression on what is called circumstantial modality. Well, I'd like to skip that now, and we can get back to it because we'll see if we actually need it. It's a bit hard to distinguish from epistemic modality. So if you're curious, let me know. We can talk about it. Maybe I'll get back to it. Just keep it in mind. We will see this again. Tomorrow, the Kratzer 81 paper talks about circumstantial modality all the time, and a distinction between that and epistemic. But it's a bit confusing, so this may help. But let's wait until we get there. The second parameter, besides this A, modal base, is called the modal force. It's called modal force because it will really then, in the formal analysis, be a quantificational force that is universal or existential or things like that. Okay? Necessity, possibility correspond to those two: universal quantification, existential quantification. And of course, then what about likelihood? Something is more or less likely, probable, very unlikely, more likely than, you know, P is more likely than Q, and so on. This can still not be addressed if you only have necessity and possibility, or universal and existential quantification. But there are proposals for dealing with that as well, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. I'm sorry, I'm putting on everything off for tomorrow. I hope at least it'll make you come back, I hope. All right. So, and just to illustrate some more of these ways in which modals differ, and which they have their own little special lexical properties, what I call subtleties here. These are just a few interesting facts that show that these two parameters here that we have here, modal base and modal force, even combined with what will be the ordering source tomorrow, don't really account for all of the variation in modal expressions. So you have things like 9, John may leave tomorrow and John must leave tomorrow. In English, 9b is extremely likely to have a deontic interpretation. That is, John has to leave tomorrow. But 9a does not have that. It can be interpreted epistemically or deontically. Why is that? We don't know. It's just the way it is. These verbs are like that. Okay. And if you then turn to the past, to past reference, if it's not about tomorrow but about yesterday, you get sentences like 10. John may have left yesterday and John must have left yesterday. Here, must, just like may, it can only be epistemic, cannot be deontic at all. And here in the paragraph that follows this example, I say that for this you might have some explanation because, after all, this is about yesterday, and Deontic modality is about permissions and obligations, and it doesn't make sense to say that you are under an obligation to have behaved in a certain way yesterday, right? You did what you did. May have been wrong, but now it's true. You can't really say you have to. You are required to have left yesterday. Perhaps that's why we don't get deontic readings for these two sentences, because of this sort of inherent nonsense that you would get under a deontic reading. Still, that of course does not explain the data in 9. Why must there cannot have an epistemic reading. And if you change the tense slightly, or the aspect slightly, you get different results for 9 with future reference. John may be leaving tomorrow can have an epistemic reading. Okay. In fact, it's a very prominent one. So John may leave tomorrow and John may be leaving tomorrow are different in this sense, which readings you get. No one knows why that is. Okay, so the next point there, may and can are interchangeable on the deontic reading, but only there. So in 12, when you have, John may leave when you do that, and John can leave when you do that, they are interchangeable if and only if the reading is deontic. That is, John will be allowed. So you're doing that will allow John to leave. On the other hand, if I want to say it's possible that John leaves when you do that, you can only say may, not can. Right. Okay, so well, let's not look at the other. Oh, well, with negation actually it's different again. John may not have left yesterday and John cannot have left yesterday. John cannot have left yesterday only has an epistemic reading. And this again may be due to the inherent nonsense that you get with deontic modality about the past. But again also, John cannot be leaving tomorrow as opposed to John cannot leave tomorrow has an epistemic reading, not a deontic one. So that again is parallel to 9. And then, so actually, yeah, I also point out here, I'm still not talking about Japanese, I'm sorry, but this is for you to analyze. What readings can you get with koto ga dekiru and so on. John, tegami ga kakeru, tegami o kaku koto ga dekiru. All these things. Which modal basis can you actually get with these? In some languages, these are lexicalized. I mentioned here French and Russian, where you famously have these different words for can, which in English you would express, translate with can. So John can walk fast, say, something like that. Who knows French? John. Tell me, if I'm, I don't know French actually. Vite. Jean peut aller vite. And Jean sait aller vite. The difference here, this literally means something like knows how to walk fast. So he has, he has learned to do it or something like that. But you wouldn't say that in the case, for example, when he had a cast on his leg and now his broken leg has healed and he is again able to walk fast. That you can only say using this one. But in English you say can for both. And it's always useful from a typological point of view to look at both of these languages, to look for cases like that, where in one language you make a distinction explicitly, which in another language is just an ambiguity that you may not even be aware of. In Russian, Ivan может and умеет I don't actually know how to spell these things in Romaji. Chodit bistro. It's a bit related, perhaps not the same. First, you. Is this the same as in French? This contrast? Is it exactly the same? Oh yeah, maybe it is. Okay. Perhaps it is, yeah. I thought there may have been a...
すみません。フランス語でジョン・セー・マクシェルって言うんですけど、ジョン・セー・マクシェビって言えないと思う。言えます。
Maybe it's...
ジョン・マクシェビは OK。
そうですか。
ジョン・マクシェビ。
ちょっとわからないけど。じゃあ、それあれと違って。これはどうですか？フランス人の。言える？おかしいですか？
問題ない。
問題？
Je peux aller vite, je peux marcher vite.
Marcher vite.
Je sais aller vite. Je sais marcher vite. Marcher vite. 問題ないと。
じゃないですか？わからないけど。もちろんそれはまたそういう問題が起こることが考えられますけど、この場合にはそうかどうかちょっとわからない。確かに時々その動詞を目的語と一緒にするとなんか言えなくなる。
いや文法的にはおかしくないんですけど、サバークの意味。サバリスペクトで、動詞のところがそのなんていうか身体的なジョンセーパーフェコンセだったら OK ですけど、ジョンセーマーシャビッツのがちょっとおかしい気がする。そんなことないですか？
問題ない。
すみません。
いや何か技術があったら、例えばスポーツでこうあるでしょ、このなんか
純粋な字は
それはなじ？
なじ OK。
OK、じゃあそれにしよう。いいんじゃない？それだったら
だから大阪弁してる人だったらあれが行けると行かれるとで違うので。
関西弁は。
すみません。全然まだ問題ない。失礼します。
はい、いや。
関西弁だったら区別ができる。だからその状況可能と能力可能。どっちが行かれるの方が、状況可能か。どっち忘れた。
多分フランス語とスペイン語同じだと思うんですけど、スペイン語もだから、技術的にスキルを身につけている場合は下のせい、サベルの方ですね。で、ポデールっていう方に当たるのが違う方の
なんか状況が。Yeah, so this is perhaps a nice illustration of what Kratzer calls circumstantial modality, right? So, if his leg has healed, that means, he can walk if he wants to. And there we have also a clear distinction between this reading and an epistemic reading, because his leg having healed has nothing to do with what I expect or believe might happen. So we have circumstantial and, this ability reading, right? lexically distinguished in some languages, but at least not as clearly in English. And yeah, well, Kansai Ben and so on. This is for you to write dissertations about how these things differ, right? Which readings you get, which are available, and so on, with different expressions. Okay, now once again back to the schedule here for these days. This was basically just a few sort of teasers or some illustrations to see what kinds of things we'll be dealing with, sort of the basic perspective. There are many different ways in which we can approach this topic of modality. From a purely descriptive point of view, as Palmer does, not really talking about some sort of formal system in which we can express these distinctions, but just doing typological and taxonomical work. There are psychological approaches to modality, psycholinguistic approaches, and so on. We will, in these 3 days, put a very heavy emphasis on formal semantics. That is, the methodological tools that we have for the analysis of these things. So we won't do a lot of data analysis. We won't look at many examples from different languages, although we'll see some. But the main emphasis is on what we have inherited from philosophical logic and adjusted to our needs for analyzing these things. That is, well, for one reason, for one thing, because I was told that people want to hear that. Secondly, it's really required if you want to read any of the semantic literature or contribute to it on modality. You have to know these formal tools, and they are not easy to get on top of. So that's why we'll be dealing with those almost exclusively. On day 1, it says here, some basic set theory. This is where many of you will be bored. This will be, I guess, the next hour. We'll talk about sets, functions, and relations, all these elementary formal things. It will show up throughout the remainder of these 3 days. And then this afternoon we will be talking about logic, modal logic, and, well, from 2 perspectives, basically, sort of the way you see it in the linguistic literature and the way you see it done in philosophy, where you talk about systems of axioms and so on. It's important to sort of be able to read both of these languages, as it were. Right, I say also at the end of this day 3 thing, time permitting, or actually the axiom systems and frames, I hope we'll get to that. First order modal logic, I'm not so sure. It actually is not very important for the rest of these 3 days, so we'll see. If we run out of time, we can sacrifice that quite easily. Okay, we can say a little bit about it, but it's another big area that we cannot really cover in 3 days. So the second day, tomorrow, Kratzer 81. If you have little time to read all these readings, that's one you should try to look at least between now and tomorrow. Kratzer 81, the notional category of modality, because as I say here, this is really the standard in formal semantics. You will not be able to read anything if you don't know that paper. And we'll discuss it in great detail and spend at least the morning on it, maybe part of the afternoon as well, just to make sure that we understand. And then the afternoon will be dedicated to problems with Kratzer's account. At least there are some objections people have had, and including, by the way, this, because Kratzer never gives you any kind of this distinction, this structural, grammatical distinction between these models. So that's something we'll look at as well. Day 3, this will be about modality and tense and time. And it's a bit early now. We don't need to talk about that in great detail. Well, it's just important to realize that modal logic, even though it's called modal logic, is not only used in analyzing modal expressions and modality. Modal logic can also be applied to time and to many other things. We'll see when you have some idea of it, we'll see that you can analyze pretty much anything using modal logic, anything, including temporal relations. And then it gets interesting when you have interactions between temporal expressions in language and modal expressions, and they work together, and you cannot really understand one without the other. That's the last paper we've been talking about. Now, this is a paper I wrote, but it's not the only reason why I like it, and I chose it. I think it will serve well as as the last thing to talk about, because several of the topics of today and tomorrow will be at work there, so we can see how it all comes together, I hope. I'm not trying to push some particular analysis or proposal on you, so by using my own paper, I don't have any agenda except illustrating how I think this kind of analysis should be done. You can then go and do your own and object or whatever. So we'll take a break now for 15 minutes until 11:15, I think that's what the schedule was like, right? And then we'll be talking about sets and relations and so on. So. You? It's okay? Everyone here? Oh, you are all here. Okay. Yeah, so like I said, in this hour we will only be talking about some preliminaries, namely, in particular, sets, relations, and functions. In particular, the relations are important because they play an important role in modal logic, and we will have to spend some time on the properties of relations and so on. And if we don't finish that in this hour, we'll spend some more time on it in the afternoon. It's worthwhile. So we'll see how far we get. Now, about sets, we will talk about these things, but who has never, well, I shouldn't say heard of sets, but who has, do you all have some background in set theory? Set theory, you know, yeah. Still, well, let's go through it a little bit. Do you agree? Should we skip it or not? No? I see a no. Let's not skip it. Okay. Well, so a set is just a collection of things, like the set of people in this room, the set containing me and this chalk, and so on. And this is a very easy concept to grasp, of course, but we have to talk a little bit about the notation that we use for sets to refer to them and to do operations on them and so on. So we can first of all write a set in this way. With these curly braces, it means a set containing these three things, A, B, C. And what's important about that is that, for one thing, order doesn't matter.